Thank you, Kerry, and thank you to the UKMS for giving me the opportunity to provide an update on the Scottish multiple myeloma pathway, albeit with a Northern Irish accent. Let's just wait for the slides. Yeah, okay. So, just by way of background, since legislation was introduced in 1999, so too the approvals of medicines for use in NHS Scotland became separate to the rest of the UK. So in 2001, we had the establishment of the Scottish Medicines Consortium, or the SMC, and their remit was to provide a single piece of advice for NHS Scotland regarding the value of a new medicine to introduce within the health service. So therefore, when a company submit to SMC, they will carry out their own health technology appraisal, which is applied to the relevant cancer pathway and also the relevant patient population for Scotland. So therefore, we don't follow the HTA advice from NICE. We also don't have a cancer drug fund or an equivalent, and we also don't have the Blue Tech form system. So these terms are kind of alien to us in Scotland. So this is a map of NHS Scotland showing the 14 territorial health boards. And whilst we have our densely populated cities with diverse socio-demographics, as we've mentioned, as Kerry mentioned, we also have swathes of the country that are relatively geographically remote. And they have probably, we know they have less well-supported healthcare infrastructure, particularly, for example, the island communities. So this, in fact, the first image is a plane landing on the island of Barra. So this is a very small island with a beach airport where, in fact, the scheduled flight times to the mainland, which will bring patients for treatment, are scheduled around tidal times, as twice a day the beach landing strip is covered in water. This is one of the legendary Calmac ferries, which many of you may have been on, and in the rough Scottish seas. But this is the reality for a lot of our patients that have to come and rely on these to receive their treatment in the mainland. So therefore, as we move forward in Scotland with our pathway, we need to have flexible options to meet these different needs of patients. But at the same time, we also need to figure out how we're going to deliver our new effective therapies like bispecifics, which are continuous, initially weekly, and how we might deliver these to patients closer to home. So one of the strengths, so we get asked a lot, what are the strengths of the SMC? And one of the strengths of the SMC is they've got a very well-developed patient and clinician engagement scheme, or the PACE process. So therefore, they will reach out to myeloma treating clinicians in all the major health boards to seek their opinion. And they're really looking for a wider opinion about the societal benefit of a treatment beyond that of just clinical and cost effectiveness. And then they may use this opinion as a modifier against any, for example, uncertainties, for example, length of follow-up data. So I think this has worked in our favour in Scotland because we were able to approve Dara-VTD earlier than other parts of the UK. We also have access to daratumumab for AL amyloid for a couple of years now, I think, compared to the rest of the UK and certainly to NHS England. We also work with quite a strict timeline of 22 weeks to release of advice. So when a company submits and when it's consideration of submission to release of advice following a PACE process, it's 22 weeks. So this is a rather busy slide, which includes most of the common treatments that we have access to for treatment of multiple myeloma in NHS Scotland. And I've put the date, November 24, because obviously this is an evolving, changing landscape. And as we've heard lots about today, we really are having all these challenges in our clinics about how best to sequence patients through these therapies, where we're thinking about all the factors we discussed earlier, and particularly the problem as newer treatments come into earlier parts of the pathway, then often later lines of therapy become redundant as time goes on. So just in the interest of time, the key differences with NHS England or the rest of the UK is we don't have access to ixazomib, lenalidomide and dexamethasone. So this was a non-submission to the SMC, so we don't have routine access for that. However, with carfilzomib and dexamethasone as a doublet, we actually have access from second line onwards, so we can use that at later lines of therapy. And like the rest of the UK, we have been lucky enough to have a flurry of positive appraisals in the last 6 months. So we have had selinexor coming in at second and fifth line, and then of course we've had not one but two bispecifics with the advice released in October. So I've just put these up to show the wording of the SMC advice regarding elranatamab and teclistamab, because it is causing a bit of debate locally. So we were very careful to mention in our PACE process that we wanted to move away from lines of therapy, that was not the modern way of thinking about myeloma treatment. And when they've released their advice, they've talked about at least 3 prior therapies and obviously triple class exposed, but they've not necessarily stipulated a restriction. But whilst we appreciate that this was in the spirit of the SMC process, was modelled around the fourth line space and fourth line comparators, it has produced a bit of debate as whether we could maybe use it earlier, like third line, for example, where we don't really have great effective regimens available at the moment. And also one of the big questions is which one do we choose to use? And I don't know the answer to that at the moment. And one of the final things to mention, a benefit that we have in NHS Scotland is a National Cancer Advisory Group. Now, this was actually started as a short life working group during COVID-19 pandemic. But due to the success of the committee, there was a business case made to put this as a business as usual or business as normal NCMAG. So we've had access to this since 2021. And we can use this programme or platform to submit a proposal to seek support for routine use of a treatment that, for example, has come off patent, or perhaps it's come off patent since it was previously reviewed by the SMC. And we can also use it if we want to apply for off-label use of a medicine, for example, for a patient population that's not specified within the marketing authorisation. And just briefly, a couple of examples where we've used this in the Scottish pathway to our benefit. So when lenalidomide became off patent in 2022, we were able to use the NCMAG programme to access lenalidomide upfront for non-transplant eligible patients, where previously we had to prove they were intolerant to thalidomide. We also then used it, for example, with carfilzomib when we moved from twice-weekly dosing to weekly dosing, because clearly this is a patient benefit, but also a day ward capacity benefit. So we were able to use that route to push that through. And finally, then, what we have submitted to NCMAG at the moment is, as we're expecting pomalidomide to come off patent and we find out what the cost price of pomalidomide will be for the NHS, then we've put in a submission to use Pomindex second line. As clearly there will be a cohort of patients who will really benefit from access to an oral doublet at second line. And similarly, we've also put in for a combination generic pomalidomide with generic bortezomib to be used with dexamethasone. So this should give us access to an effective triplet from second line, but also a cost saving for the NHS compared to some of the other triplets. And if the patients learn to self-administer the bortezomib, then they become largely independent of hospital or haematology day wards, which is clearly a benefit for capacity. So we'll meet with the council following our submission next month in December, and we should have a decision on this reached by January. So therefore, if we watch this space, hopefully we'll have some positive news in January, how these will then fit into our pathway. And our plan, once we have finished this piece of work with NCMAG, then we're going to tackle high-risk multiple myeloma going forward, and whether this is going to be a suitable pathway to go down the NCMAG route. And of course, then with all the other drug appraisals that we're expecting over the next kind of 12 to 18 months, we'll see the pathway evolve again. And I'll stop there and hand over to Sarah. Thank you.